Bonjour tout le monde. Hi everybody. Bienvenue au lancement du livre Mila UNESCO sur les angles morts de la gouvernance de l'IA. Welcome to the joint launch of this amazing book co-edited by Mila and UNESCO on the missing links on AI governance. I'm Ludovic Soussis. Je suis Ludovic Soussis, je suis le directeur des communications et des affaires publiques de Mila. Je vais être le maître de cérémonie. Notez que la première partie de cet événement se déroulera essentiellement en français. So the first part, the opening remarks of this event will be mostly in French. L'événement se déroulera en 4 volets essentiellement. Premier volet, ce seront les remarques d'introduction, donc les discours d'introduction. Ensuite, avec une présentation du livre de la part de 2 co-auteurs de Mila. S'en suivra une conversation fort attendue entre Dr. Kate Crawford, professeur Bengio, modérée par Valérie Pisano, la PDG de Mila. Et finalement, une période de questions d'une 15aine de minutes à la toute fin de la conversation. So after the conversation with Professor Bengio and Dr. Crawford, you'll have a 15-minute question period for the people in the crowd. And you will have 2 media opportunities for the media. Donc, la première opportunité média sera après les allocutions d'ouverture, au moment du début de la discussion avec M. Bengio et Mme Crawford. Benjamin Prudhomme se rendra disponible pour une dizaine de minutes et après la période de questions dans la salle, il y aura une autre période de questions pour les journalistes cette fois-ci. So the journalists will have 2 opportunities, one after the opening remarks and one after the question period by the people in the room. J'aimerais commencer l'événement par reconnaître que Mila est située en territoire autochtone, lequel n'a jamais été cédé. Nous reconnaissons la nation K comme gardienne des terres et des eaux sur lesquelles nous nous réunissons aujourd'hui. Bengio K, Montréal, est historiquement connu comme un lieu de rassemblement pour de nombreuses Premières Nations et aujourd'hui, une population autochtone diversifiée ainsi que d'autres peuples y résident. C'est dans le respect des liens avec le passé, le présent et l'avenir que nous reconnaissons les relations continues entre les premiers peuples et autres personnes de la communauté montréalaise. Mila reconnaît les obstacles systémiques auxquels sont confrontés les peuples autochtones en matière d'éducation, d'emploi, de territoire et de technologie. Les savoirs et les connaissances autochtones ont généralement été dévalués, exclus et effacés de la science de l'intelligence artificielle. Et nous reconnaissons donc la nécessité d'un engagement à travailler avec les peuples des Premières Nations dans la recherche et la science de l'intelligence artificielle. Donc, j'invite Mme Valérie Pisano à venir donner quelques réflexions sur le livre.
Wow! C'est toujours un peu émouvant de voir autant de gens dans une salle. Good morning, everyone. Bonjour à tous, bienvenue. Écoutez, à mon nom personnel, au nom du professeur Bengio, au nom de tous mes collègues à Mila, ça me fait vraiment plaisir du fond du cœur de vous souhaiter la bienvenue ce matin. On behalf of Professor Bengio and of all of our colleagues at Mila, welcome. Thank you for being here this morning for this exceptionally rich, interesting, and important event. A very special thanks to Professor or Dr. Kate Crawford. Thank you so much, Kate, for accepting our invitation, for being a part of this. Thank you to UNESCO for your trust, your partnership, and thank you to all the authors and co-authors of this book, Missing Links in AI Governance. Merci à tous les auteurs et co-auteurs de ce livre. Merci de nous avoir partagé vos réflexions. Puis d'avoir contribué à ce qui, on l'espère, va alimenter une conversation de très grande importance sur ce sujet. L'événement d'aujourd'hui, c'est à propos de grandes idées, de grands esprits, tout ça à un moment charnière et critique de notre histoire. Today's event is about big ideas, big minds or great minds, all of this at a very pivotal time in our history, in the history of mankind. I think we can all agree just by scanning through the newspapers that AI, while the potential of it has always been there and, for the last couple of years with all kinds of ups and downs, right now it's one of the foremost conversations for all of us in all spheres of our lives and society. L'événement d'aujourd'hui a comme deux volets. Today's event has two dimensions to it. On one hand, we're launching a book that results from a historic collaboration. C'est une collaboration vraiment historique, il faut le souligner, entre l'UNESCO et Mila, a historic collaboration between UNESCO and Mila that brings forward the latest, most provocative, most relevant thought leadership about AI governance. I was talking to my colleague Benjamin Prudhomme earlier, and he said, in the spirit of the book, we really wanted to push boundaries, not say what everyone was saying already, but say something new, say something different, try to think about where we were going next. And of course, évidemment, la deuxième volet de notre événement aujourd'hui, c'est une grande conversation. It's an incredible privilege to host today a conversation between two of the world's topmost leaders in AI, but also two of the strongest advocates for it being developed in an ethical, socially responsible, and sustainable way. So if you think that part of the event is going to be, stuff you've heard of before, hopefully not, because just in the couple of minutes when, we were getting gathered, there was already a lot of appetite and energy to say, okay, what are we going to do about this? C'est deux leaders de la sphère ou du monde de l'intelligence artificielle qui sont excités par tout sauf le statu quo, puis qui sont très mobilisés par l'importance d'encadrer cette technologie qui a un énorme potentiel, mais aussi qui pose des risques très réels pour notre société. Throughout the book, and certainly throughout our conversation today, you're going to see we talk about topics like feminism, indigenous rights, LGBTI people, deepfakes, autonomous weapons, SDGs, pandemics. Topics we can all agree are among the biggest challenges and opportunities of our society, of us at this moment in history, and even more so within the context of everything that's happened in the last few months, where there's this increased urgency to look at and try to answer some of the questions addressed in the book, namely around how this technology is going to serve the potential and the future of human life on Earth. So as you can see, this is something that we hold very dear to heart for me personally and for all of us at Mila. C'est un sujet et une conversation qui nous tient énormément à cœur. Il y a des mois, voire des années de travail qui ont mené à la journée d'aujourd'hui. Donc, sans plus tarder, je vous souhaite un bon événement. Merci d'être là. Enjoy. This should be fun.
Merci Valérie. Thanks Valérie. Nous avons deux allocutions préenregistrées. La première de Michel Bonsaint, représentant du gouvernement du Québec au sein de la délégation permanente du Canada auprès de l'UNESCO. Donc, elle arrive.
Alors, c'est un plaisir de représenter aujourd'hui le gouvernement du Québec à cet important lancement de l'ouvrage intitulé « Les angles morts de l'intelligence artificielle ». Je tiens tout d'abord à remercier et saluer les équipes de Mila et de l'UNESCO, de même que les auteurs qui ont travaillé à la réalisation et à la rédaction de cet ouvrage. Je tiens à saluer également Mme Crawford et M. Bengio pour l'échange prometteur d'aujourd'hui sur les espoirs et les préoccupations liées à l'intelligence artificielle. La gouvernance de l'intelligence artificielle est au cœur de l'action du Québec à l'UNESCO depuis 2019, soit depuis le moment où les États membres ont pris la décision de travailler à l'élaboration d'une recommandation sur l'éthique de l'intelligence artificielle. Et dès le début de ce processus d'élaboration, le gouvernement s'est associé à Mila pour mener une consultation mondiale au nom de l'UNESCO. D'ailleurs, dans le cadre de ces travaux à l'UNESCO, le gouvernement du Québec a une volonté de mettre en valeur l'important écosystème québécois en intelligence artificielle. Et Mila, nous en convenons tous, constitue un fleuron de cet écosystème québécois de l'intelligence artificielle. Compte tenu des attentes, mais aussi des incertitudes de l'IA, notamment ce qui a trait au biais et à la diversité, le gouvernement est particulièrement préoccupé par la protection et la promotion du français et la découvrabilité des contenus culturels, scientifiques et autres, francophones et québécois en ligne. Il y va de l'avenir de son économie, de sa culture, de sa science. En d'autres mots, l'IA doit être inclusive et au bénéfice de tous. Nous croyons que le Québec peut jouer un rôle significatif dans la gouvernance de l'IA et dans la mise en œuvre de la recommandation de l'UNESCO. Nous n'avons qu'à nous rappeler la Déclaration de Montréal adoptée en 2018 et qui traitait du développement responsable de l'IA. Alors aujourd'hui, 5 ans plus tard, toujours à Montréal, le lancement de cet ouvrage constitue un autre geste marquant pour un développement responsable de l'IA. Le travail de réflexion et d'analyse à travers cet ouvrage est remarquable et essentiel. Je vous remercie.
Et maintenant, une allocution de Tafik Jelassi, sous-directeur général de l'UNESCO pour la communication et l'information.
Madame Valérie Pisano, présidente et chef de la direction de l'Institut d'intelligence artificielle du Québec. Madame Carole Jabé, directrice des fonds de recherche du Québec Santé. Représentants du gouvernement du Québec, membres de la communauté universitaire, chers collègues, mesdames et messieurs. C'est avec grand plaisir que l'UNESCO participe aujourd'hui au lancement de la publication Missing Links in AI Governance. Alors que le développement et l'utilisation de l'intelligence artificielle se poursuivent, cette technologie continue de défier nos idées de ce qui est possible. C'est le grand public qui a commencé à imaginer, avec l'IA générative telle que le chat GPT, ce que l'avenir pourrait nous réserver à tous. Aujourd'hui, les applications de l'IA concernent le traitement du langage naturel, les procédures judiciaires, les véhicules autonomes et la cartographie des maladies, pour ne citer que quelques domaines. L'IA ouvre de nouvelles perspectives pour atteindre les objectifs de développement durable de l'ONU. À l'UNESCO, nous explorons particulièrement l'impact et les opportunités de l'IA pour l'éducation, les sciences naturelles et sociales, la culture, la communication et l'information. L'IA a un potentiel significatif pour favoriser le développement durable, mais sa complexité et ses avancées posent un défi non seulement pour la gouvernance de l'IA, mais aussi pour la protection des droits de l'homme. L'UNESCO a dirigé la réflexion mondiale sur les préoccupations urgentes relatives à l'IA. En 2021, 193 États membres de l'UNESCO ont adopté la recommandation sur l'éthique de l'intelligence artificielle, qui est le premier instrument normatif mondial dans ce domaine. Si l'IA doit avant tout être centrée sur l'humain, comme cela est généralement admis, l'UNESCO reconnaît également les défis auxquels de nombreux pays sont confrontés concernant le développement et la gouvernance de l'IA. Cette publication, fruit de la collaboration entre l'UNESCO et l'Institut Mila, avec le soutien du gouvernement du Québec, contribue de manière importante à la réflexion sur les défis de gouvernance et les lacunes en matière de capacités humaines et institutionnelles auxquelles les pays sont confrontés pour assurer l'utilisation fiable et responsable de l'IA. Ladies and gentlemen, as we launch this publication, it is important to emphasize that the development and governance of AI require careful consideration and responsible decision-making, especially in areas of missing links. It is crucial that policymakers and civil society members are equipped with the necessary insights and perspectives to ensure that the development of AI is guided by fundamental rights and freedoms and is ethical and responsible. While this publication provides valuable insights into various aspects of AI governance, we also recognize the need for more accessible and concise information for decision makers. Therefore, we are seeking funding to produce policy briefs on relevant topics to supplement this publication. The establishment of trustworthy and responsible AI is an essential step towards creating inclusive and peaceful societies. We hope that this publication will spark important discussions and raise critical questions to ensure that AI benefits everyone and leaves no one behind. We are grateful to the authors, to Mila, to the Government of Quebec, and to our colleagues for their invaluable contributions to this publication. I look forward to listening to today's conversation between Professor Yoshia Bengio and Professor Kate Crawford, two world-class experts on AI. I also look forward to engaging with you in the future on the important topic of AI governance. I wish you an inspiring reading of this report and a fruitful discussion during today's event. Thank you for your kind attention.
Donc, nous invitons Mme Carole Jabet, directrice secteur santé des fonds de recherche du Québec.
Bon matin à tous et toutes. Valérie, Yoshua, Kate, permettez-moi de vous appeler par vos prénoms, ça va être plus familial. La recherche est un domaine familial. Ça me fait plaisir ici d'être avec vous tous, plaisir de représenter les 3 fonds de recherche du Québec, donc pas juste le mien en santé, puis on aura l'occasion d'y revenir. Puis je dirais que je suis encore plus ravie après avoir entendu le brefage tout à l'heure entre Yoshua et Kate, et je suis sûre qu'ils vont vous fasciner aussi par la posture qu'ils adoptent. Les FRQ sont complices à plusieurs égards au niveau de cette publication. Tout d'abord, on a une collaboration de longue date avec l'UNESCO, on le sait ou on le sait moins. Nous permettons le développement de chaires de recherche, 17, dites des chaires UNESCO. Puis j'ai aussi des collaborateurs, collaboratrices autour de moi à l'intérieur des fonds de recherche comme Mila and UNESCO, notre directrice aux affaires éthiques et juridiques, qui participe très, très activement aux différentes sessions de travail concernant notamment l'éthique et l'intégrité en recherche. On voit un petit peu où je m'en vais, je pense que ça fait partie du sujet du jour. On est également complice avec le ministère des Relations internationales qui ont rendu possible cette publication et cet ouvrage. Donc, bien content de ce partenariat également de longue date. Le soutien qui est apporté à la publication est cohérent avec la posture des FRQ. Soutenir et promouvoir la recherche et sa relève dans leur excellence, leur diversité et leur ouverture afin de stimuler la découverte et l'innovation. Voilà bien notre mandat, et ce pour une recherche qui est accessible, qui est engagée à comprendre le monde et qui est porteuse de solutions aux défis de société. Autrement dit, une recherche responsable. C'est aussi avec cette posture que les FRQ soutiennent depuis maintenant plusieurs années, et probablement, je devrais dire, depuis quelques dizaines d'années, le développement des connaissances et des applications en IA. On parle de regroupement, on parle de carrière de recherche, on parle maintenant de chaire de recherche double, figurez-vous, qui associe IA et santé, et même on parle d'une priorité dans nos collaborations internationales, que ce soit avec la France, que ce soit avec la Belgique, que ce soit avec la Bavière, que ce soit bientôt, on espère, avec le Royaume-Uni. Cette posture, qui nous paraît tellement essentielle, c'est aussi celle que nous avons adoptée en échangeant avec les leaders en IA, leaders dont vous faites partie. Et dans la foulée de la déclaration de Montréal pour une IA responsable, c'est cette posture qui nous a dit « Nous avons besoin d'un forum pour réfléchir et conseiller sur les impacts sociaux et sociétaux de l'IA et du numérique. » Et c'est pourquoi nous soutenons l'OBVIA, cet observatoire qui regroupe maintenant plus de 250 chercheurs à travers tout le Québec, mais aussi au niveau canadien et au niveau international, pour une utilisation toujours responsable de cette intelligence artificielle. Alors, vous allez me dire, si on a tous les véhicules, pourquoi un ouvrage comme celui-ci? Puis pourquoi un tel intérêt? Alors, je vais me permettre une petite digression. Je viens du monde de la recherche en santé. Ça a été dit dans mon introduction. Et je suis assez vieille pour avoir connu l'émoi de Dolly. Dolly, ce mouton cloné qui est apparu. Je suis également assez alerte pour suivre les discussions qui ont lieu autour de technologies comme CRISPR-Cas9. Jouer dans l'ADN. C'est des promesses, mais c'est aussi des peurs. C'est des promesses de guérison, ce sont des peurs d'eugénisme. Les débats éthiques se sont alors imposés. Au moment de Dolly et même avant, CRISPR-Cas9, ça continue. Ils se sont imposés largement. Dans les établissements universitaires, dans les établissements de santé, dans les ministères, dans les gouvernements, dans les organisations telles que l'UNESCO notamment, mais aussi dans les foyers des citoyens, des citoyennes, de nos voisins, de nos voisines. Ils se poursuivent, ces débats-là. Et grâce à eux, nous sommes capables de faire des choix. L'ouvrage d'aujourd'hui, pour moi, est empreint d'une démarche analogue. Regarder les angles morts, les chercher, les comprendre, qu'il s'agisse d'inclusion, et on devrait dire plutôt d'exclusion vis-à-vis de certaines populations, qu'il s'agisse d'utilisation plus que questionnable en regard du bien commun, qu'il s'agisse de concentration du pouvoir, comme j'ai entendu tout à l'heure, qu'il s'agisse d'une manipulation du contenu conduisant à une désinformation absolument grave et certaine. Bref, ces angles morts sont nombreux. Les nommer, les comprendre, les dénoncer, c'est se donner la chance de définir et redéfinir en continu nos attentes comme société pour un développement de l'IA éthique, inclusif et respectueux des droits humains. Il me serait difficile de conclure sans évoquer le fait que cet ouvrage existe aussi en français. Puis c'est la journée de la francophonie, la journée internationale de la francophonie, alors ne m'en veuillez pas de m'exprimer juste en français. Nous parlons aujourd'hui de mobilisation de connaissances et de participation à une réflexion sociale. Pouvoir le faire dans sa langue est absolument essentiel pour atteindre nos objectifs. Le Québec est un lieu privilégié de la science en français qu'il faut promouvoir plus que jamais. Les FRQ étaient d'ailleurs associés à Data Franca pour le lexique « Les 101 mots de l'intelligence artificielle » et je n'ai pas traduit le titre. Ouvrage qui a été lancé en janvier dernier ici même au Mila. Alors, compte tenu de l'importance de cette science en français, au passage, les FRQ organisent les 26 et 27 avril prochains à Montréal des débats à ce sujet et dans cette langue. Je vous y invite certainement avec enthousiasme et c'est cette invitation qui sera mon mot de conclusion. félicitations à tous ceux qui ont participé à l'élaboration de l'ouvrage. J'espère que la communauté en fera bon usage et j'en suis certaine. Merci bien.
Merci beaucoup, Madame Jabel. L'invitation est envoyée. Alors maintenant, il nous fait plaisir de vous présenter deux co-auteurs du livre. Donc, Benjamin Prudhomme, directeur exécutif du département IA pour l'humanité de Mila, et professeur Gulnouch Farnadi, professeur à l'Université de Montréal à HEC, titulaire d'une chaire du Canada IA CIFAR et membre académique principal de Mila. Alors, je vous demanderai tous les deux de venir.
Merci, Ludovic. Bonjour à tous et à toutes. Je me posais la question en me préparant. Je me disais, c'est presque anachronique de faire un livre quand on parle d'intelligence artificielle. Alors, pourquoi un livre à ce moment-ci? D'abord parce que les développements en intelligence artificielle sont extraordinairement rapides. On le savait depuis quelques années quand même qu'on pouvait s'attendre à certains breakthroughs, mais soudainement, depuis quelques mois, ça a fait place dans les salons des gens et tout le monde en parle. Ça affecte tous les pans de la société, à la fois pour des risques, mais aussi des opportunités. On peut penser par exemple à la crise climatique, à la santé, et ça requiert une gouvernance. Et d'une certaine façon, c'est un peu ce que le livre met de l'avant, mais c'est un livre qui est, je vais dire en anglais, unapologetic, à propos du besoin des gouvernements puis des organisations internationales d'investir cet espace-là. L'autoréglementation peut fonctionner partiellement, mais si on veut se doter d'outils qui vont bénéficier collectivement à chacun et chacune d'entre nous, on a besoin d'interventions, on a besoin d'interventions musclées, on a besoin d'interventions qui protègent les droits de la personne, qui favorisent le développement d'une IA inclusive et responsable. Mila a pour mission d'être un leader international dans le développement de l'IA, mais il y a une partie de la phrase après, c'est dans le développement de l'IA au bénéfice de tous et toutes. Et je pense que ce livre-là s'inscrit dans cette mission-là pour donner des outils dans un langage accessible d'abord et avant tout pour un large public puis des décideurs politiques sur certains des grands enjeux que l'intelligence artificielle soulève et qui requièrent leur attention. Il y avait 4 principes fondateurs derrière la rédaction de l'ouvrage. Le premier, c'était la demande aux auteurs d'identifier des angles morts. Et c'est important parce que quand vous regardez ce livre-là, vous allez voir que vraiment, on a invité les gens à porter leur regard sur ce dont on ne parlait pas assez et non ce qu'on savait déjà relativement bien. Et c'est l'une des choses importantes, c'est que l'IA bouleverse vraiment profondément les structures de nos sociétés. Et d'une certaine façon, ce qu'on invitait les auteurs à faire, c'est de se poser la question, peut-être que « what got us here won't get us there ». Et qu'est-ce que ça veut dire que de se poser cette question-là de façon plus directe? Deuxièmement, l'interdisciplinarité. Donc, on n'arrivera pas à encadrer l'IA puis ses conséquences en pensant seulement de façon technologique, pas plus d'ailleurs qu'en pensant seulement à propos du prisme des sciences sociales. Il faut vraiment créer des moments. Puis ce livre-là, j'espère, peut être un des nombreux moments où on invite les gens à la discussion. Le troisième principe, c'est un principe d'inclusion. C'est quelque chose qui est très, très cher à Mila et qui, franchement, est inquiétant dans la façon dont l'IA se développe. Il y a certaines populations qu'on retrouve peu ou pas. On ne peut pas vraiment manquer ce bateau-là, donc on espère qu'on a réussi à faire honneur à cette valeur-là. Et la quatrième, c'était multipartite. Donc, à nouveau, cette idée d'interdisciplinarité, mais de ne pas développer un livre qui soit uniquement d'universitaires, mais aussi de décideurs politiques, de chercheurs, de membres de la société civile et d'organisations communautaires. Ensuite, quelques merci sont de mise, d'abord pour le gouvernement du Québec et les fonds de recherche du Québec qui ont rendu l'ouvrage possible. Ensuite, évidemment, à mes co-directrices, Gulnouch et Catherine, it's been a journey, but it's also been quite the thrill. Ensuite, à l'UNESCO pour votre soutien pendant les 2 dernières années et plus spécifiquement à Pratique Cibal, Sacha Rubel, Vanessa Dreher et Charline d'Oultremont. Ensuite, à tous les auteurs qui se sont prêtés à l'exercice, c'est du temps, c'est de l'énergie et c'est un peu une partie de soi. On a demandé aux gens de se prononcer sur des choses qui leur tenaient vraiment à cœur et de s'exposer à ces questions-là à l'extérieur du champ universitaire, mais aussi de façon plus large. Donc, merci de vous être prêtés à l'exercice. And last and not least, Kate and Joshua for showing up today. You are, of course, as I'm sure everywhere you're going, but you're, of course, two very, very stellar members of this book. And I think your engagement coming up on this stage and talking about this outside just the academic world is really, it's impressive. It's something we're very grateful for, certainly something I'm very interested in hearing as well. And so I would stop and then give it to Golnoush by leaving you on 3 core insights that, in my view, kind of come out of this book as a whole. The first one is a dire need for being far more inclusive in the way we develop AI. And that goes beyond representation. So of course, it means having women at the table and having indigenous communities at the table and so on, but it also means being very thoughtful about how we develop AI systems, what kind of data we use, what kind of design we choose to go for. And so it goes to representation, but it goes far beyond. And it's frankly just, it's an opportunity or a risk that we really need to tackle. The second one is, as I said earlier, a need for governmental and international organizations leadership. Businesses can do their part, but the role of government and international organizations are to make sure that whatever happens in society, and this is one of the big, very, very big things that's happening, is done in a way that's collectively beneficial. And the third one is, and it's, I think, a great way of opening the conversation, is one inviting people to stop looking at AI as a neutral technology and rather think about it as a place of power. And so that means asking who holds that power and who doesn't, who benefits from that power and who's excluded from it. And frankly, it goes to the question as to what are the structures that we can provide ourselves? Because if with great power comes great responsibility. And so if we in this room are the holders of that power, then what are the structures that we're going to put forward to address it and to make sure that we really foster the opportunities of AI and mitigate the risks? So on this note, Golnoush, I turn to you. You can just compare.
Thank you, Benjamin. I'm also taking this opportunity to welcome you to this event. This book, I started working with Benjamin and Catherine and UNESCO 2 years ago, and I couldn't be happier or more proud that I'm here today at the launch event of this book. I'm very proud of this book, and as the name suggests, we are talking about the missing links. Missing links is that, like, we have included the topics that you're not really seeing, that people are talking about it most often, but we believed that we should talk about these things, and we wanted to give a spotlight to those topics in this book. So this book, I'm very proud of, and I think it's a very important topic, and I want to encourage you to read about this book because we included the topics of, like, as Benjamin mentioned, like how AI can change the industry in a sense of the power. It has an influence on education, healthcare. It has an influence on finance and economy. So these are important topics that everyone should care about them. And this book, I'm just encouraging you to read about it and this book be the start of a discussion and not being the missing links anymore, and be the spotlight topics. I also take this opportunity to talk about one of the chapters of this book that I contributed to, which we talked about the role of ethics and fairness in AI industry, the challenges, the opportunities. And I conducted interviews with 7 researchers from industry and academia, also activists, the journalists. And I try to include the voice of people who are known as being minorities. So I included the voice of women, Black people from Asia, from Africa, from Europe, from North America, to talk about, like, why it is challenging to talk about ethics and algorithmic fairness. Because AI industry, I think, is like every industry nowadays is AI industry. So talking about this aspects is important because fairness is not about it's not a technical challenge. It's a social technical challenge. And it affects all of us, right? We are as a customers, as a developers, and we need to think about it. Interesting thing is that I encourage you to read that chapter.
I have 7 people that I interviewed with, and 2 of them that are working in industry in North America, they got laid off. And both of them were AI ethics leaders in industry. So it is an important topic. I did that interview 2 years ago, and I think it's more important today to discuss these topics. So without further ado, I invite you to listen to great Joshua and Kate. They're going to have a debate about it, and enjoy the event. Thank you so much.
Merci, Benjamin. Thank you, Golnush. For les médias, for the medias, we have a 15-minute period right now with Benjamin. For the media representatives who want to wait after the conversation. So at the end of the event, after the question period, you will have another moment for interviews. Donc, j'invite Valérie Pisano, Kate Crawford et Joshua Bengio à s'installer sur la scène.
All right, let's get to it, guys. Okay, I'm going off script. This tends to happen, but I was inspired by what a lot of the people said in their opening remarks. So I want to start by hearing each of you on why you care. Of all the things you could be doing today or in the course of the last few months, and of all the institutes with whom UNESCO could have interacted, like why Joshua Bengio, why Mila? Why is this important to you, Joshua?
I want to give meaning to my life. I think that's one of the best things being human is about. And doing the research in AI in the last not working. Right. So
It was so nice. You have to start again. I'm sorry, Joshua.
so I think one of the important parts of being human is this working now?
It should be working, yeah.
All right, I'll just use this. An important part of being human is why are you doing what you're doing, and feeling good about what you do. And when you think and act to give back, to help, to contribute to others in society, I think this is an amazingly good feeling that motivates a lot of people and a lot of people at Mila. And this is something we've tried to put in Mila's values that we need more of in society. John Lennon would. So
I'm happy to share.
is this working? Yeah.
Thank you. Sorry about that.
Yes, you can.
Yes. So yeah, in AI specifically since 2013, more or less, it's not anymore just an academic question. It's changing the world. It has been progressing every year, and now we're all like amazed and scared, and I think forced to think, what do we do?
Kate, it was a very bold decision on your part to write a book that basically criticizes from front to back cover this industry that you participate in, right? So the Atlas of AI, of course, I'm referencing to. So why is this important to you? You could feel throughout the book, and I've listened to a few of your podcasts, there's this energy to say, beyond the technology, beyond the science that, of course, both of you have dedicated your lives to, there needs to be more. Tell us a bit about that.
Well, first of all, hi, everyone. It's lovely to see you here. And thank you so much, Joshua and Valerie, for inviting me to join you for this very important book launch. In terms of myself, I started 20 years ago researching how large-scale technologies are influencing the world. And as a social scientist, 20 years ago, it was quite unusual to see this as something that was important and necessary to understand the full impacts of these systems. And one of the things that has always concerned me is that there is a tendency, particularly in AI, to focus on the data and the algorithms and sometimes the infrastructure, but that's it. And this is, I think, a very serious error, that we do not look at the large-scale material impacts of these systems. So what I wanted to do for Atlas of AI is to understand how AI is made, and I mean that in the fullest sense. So I ended up getting out from behind my desk and going to visit the lithium mines, going to the clickworker factories, going inside distribution centers, as well as going to the labs where these systems are made. And what I saw was really a system that is profoundly extractive by nature. So you think about how training sets are made. It's really based on capturing the commons of the internet and using that to make ground truth. And then looking at the labor dynamics, everything from mine workers through to the experience of being a data labeler. This is throughout the supply chain of AI, but we rarely talk about the human layer. And then finally, the full environmental impacts of planetary scale computation. That means looking at energy, looking at water, and looking at the mineralogical components to make large scale servers. In doing all of this work, it completely transformed my thinking. And I thought it was important to share that with a global reading audience to say, we are building systems where we are not looking at the full impacts of the bargains we are making. And what was clear to me also is that these are systems that concentrate power. And that is something that Joshua and I have spoken about for several years now. But it has only become more significant in the 2 years since the book was published. Particularly now with generative AI, we're seeing fewer than 6 companies produce generative AI at scale. That is one of the most concentrated industries in the world. So how are we going to deal with that? And I think it's the people in this room. Many of you are going to be at the forefront of building these systems, but also thinking about their governance. And honestly, I think it is the most important thing we could be doing now.
So let's get into this theme of power. So in the UNESCO book, your contribution is actually one of the chapters from the Atlas of AI. It's about data. And I'm going to quote a sentence from it. You say, the myth of data collection as a benevolent practice in computer science has obscured its operations of power, protecting those who profit most while avoiding responsibility for its consequences. This is also a theme that Yuval Harari explores in 21 Lessons for a 21st Century that has inspired some of the work we do here. So let's get into this. AI, the impact of the extraction to create this industry, and then what it's creating as a polarized or an unbalanced power dynamic in the world.
Well, I'm sure many people in this room are aware of the downsides of scraping the internet and calling that ground truth, of all of the biases, all of the skews, all of the flotsam and jetsam that supposedly represents the world and regularly fails to do so. But I want to talk about something else, which is the newer shift that we've seen, particularly with generative AI. So what we're seeing now is companies like OpenAI scraping the creative work of not just decades, but centuries of artistic practice, images, words, code, and then again, in so many ways, ascribing that to their own systems that will profit very few people. So how do we think about all of the labor that went into all of those images, all of those books, all of that code? This is something that at the moment, we have no system of recompense. People have no consent, they have no credit, and they have no compensation. Now, that is a serious problem if we think about what that data represents. But there's actually an optimistic way to think about this, which is to look to history. So historically, there was another transformative technology, just as powerful as generative AI, that was invented in 1897, and it was called the player piano. Does anyone here know what a player piano is? Yeah, a couple of people, wonderful. So you've probably seen those wax cylinders that had little imprinted code, really, of music that allowed you to create an automated piano. So when these were first invented, musicians were horrified. They said this was going to automate the work of reading and playing music. So what we saw, in fact, was a significant regulatory move. In 1909, the US Congress passes the Copyright Act that says, we will create a mechanical license that will allow you to produce these cylinders, to produce mechanical music, but you also have to pay artists. And that became the basis of the modern music industry. So I think we have to look at these examples to say, how do we regulate what is happening with data collection and AI so that we recognize the important creative labor that has made all of these systems possible? So part of what I think we can also do as a tool here is to look to history, to say, how have we dealt with transformative general technologies in the past, and what are we going to do now? Because I think what we cannot do is allow people to simply just be used as raw material, to just have their labor extracted, and to never have the gains of generative AI shared more generally.
I just want to comment on this. I feel like we can't apply the same recipe because it's not one author, but it's everyone. So maybe a better way to think about this is that all of that data that humans are producing that is feeding into these large AI systems is really contributing to a collective wealth and should be treated as such, rather than, like the mining industries that exist in different countries like here, where essentially it's free to use what's under the ground, and then you can make profit of it. And for a time, it might seem like a reasonable thing to incentivize companies to do that extraction. But I think we've reached the point, both in mining, hopefully before, and in AI, where we have to think, okay, but really this is something that belongs to everyone. How do we make sure, yes, that technology is developed for good, and somehow the wealth that is created goes back to everyone? And that's connected to, of course, the question of concentration of power, because wealth and power are closely connected.
The chapter you contribute to in the book, Joshua, is called Innovation Ecosystems for Socially Beneficial AI. And you said this a bit in your opening remarks. You do this work because you fundamentally believe it can create a better place for us all, right, in the future. The quote I chose is, as the current laissez-faire approach in the AI industry has demonstrated, the market is unlikely to develop socially beneficial technologies with the size and scope that are needed to address some of the most intractable or important global challenges, from climate change to education to health, which is an area you focused on. I know one of your core convictions is a bit of a redesign of our social and political structures, right? So the world has changed. You need to adapt the infrastructure that's holding that world, and social political structures is part of that. So tell us a bit more about some of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so first of all, I'm not a social scientist, and but at some point, a number of years ago, I realized that there's a way, there's a mathematical way to think about society and the economic systems we have. And you can think of the existence, first of all, of a misalignment between what happens if you push towards profit maximization. What direction does it want to go, versus what is the direction that would be best for society to improve the well-being of everyone? And ideally, these two things would coincide, but they don't. So you can think these are like two vectors, and there's an angle between them. If it was 180 degrees, it would be easy. We could just get rid of profit maximization, but it's not that simple, because that capitalist system also brought a lot of good things. So first of all, we need to recognize that how this is being fixed right now is with governments that are putting regulation to try to steer, companies closer to the well-being of everyone. And okay, I think it has worked reasonably well, and there are a lot of problems, and I think we need to continue in that direction, but I don't think it's enough, because we're building very powerful tools, and AI is one of them. I think biotechnology is as scary and has a huge positive potential. Both of them have a huge positive potential to save us from things that we don't know how to tackle, like climate change, future pandemics. And it has motivated a lot of my own research and a lot of research at Mila and in many research centers around the world, including in companies actually, to develop AI tools that are more directly aligned with the needs of society, even if they're not sufficiently profitable for companies to invest in. So we need governments to do that investment because it's going to help everyone. But we also need to realize that as the tools we're building become more and more powerful, that way of dealing with the problem may be insufficient. That that we may be hitting into a wall. And the image I have to think about this is, imagine that in a few years from now, maybe a decade from now, AI has become so powerful that it can be as destructive as say nuclear bombs. So what if a few people have that power? Well, first of all, there's the problem of power concentration. The more powerful the tool, the more powerful the weapon, the more you can concentrate power, you can control others and so on. And that's a big danger for democracy. But also, somebody that's just crazy or stupid can press on the button and bang, we all lose. So how do we change society to deal with those dangers? This is a huge question.
And it takes us to the topic of international governance, right? So nation states have work to do within their frontiers, within their boundaries, but the question of AI or the potency of AI is global. So what are some of your emerging thoughts, both of you, around the potential, the possibility? Is this even feasible?
Well, I'm really glad, Joshua, that you mentioned nuclear power and nuclear fission, because again, we have good historical examples that we can go to here. So the Nuclear Energy Commission is an example of an international structure that was created to monitor and to inspect nuclear energy facilities internationally. And it was decided that this capacity for power generation is so dangerous and has such a proximity to weaponization that it was in the interests of international peace and governance that it should be managed transparently and should be open to inspection. We have done this in the past, but we don't have anything similar to this at the moment. What we have is a very small number of privately held companies that are motivated by, in many cases, either shareholder profit or individual profit, that are not sharing what they're doing. We actually have a profoundly opaque system. I'm thinking now, of course, of GPT-4, of the recent paper that was published just last week. Is 100 pages that tells us nothing about how it is built. What is the data that it's using? What is the algorithmic approach?
It used to be better.
It used to be better.
We had a good decade of industry developing AI in a much more open science way.
Precisely.
But I'm really concerned that we're going to lose a good part of that.
We share this concern. And I think it has two significant challenges built within it. The first is a scientific challenge. I think it is a problem for us as scientists to not understand how something is built, particularly if it is going to be then applied to healthcare, to education, to criminal justice, to hiring. This presents a very real social threat if we cannot understand its workings. But it also presents a governance challenge. So we're, of course, talking about both state level and international governance. It is very hard to govern and regulate something that you cannot see into. And so we actually have to start thinking about what are the mechanisms to say this requires inspection. Now, of course, the argument that you'll hear from companies is that this is essentially a question of commercial competitive threat. We have to keep it secret. It's a trade secret, but we can't tell you how it works. Well, we have many industries whereby even if you keep commercial confidence, you still have to be open to inspection, to regulation, and to auditing. So we are looking, I think, very closely to having to have something similar in AI. But I agree with you, Joshua. I don't think it's entirely enough. I think we have a misalignment between the sorts of incentivized capitalist structures that drive the creation of AI with these issues around greater social benefit and actually sharing social goods, which you began with. And so I think it's a question we have to ask ourselves. If we are really concerned about this process of public inclusion and public sharing of the wealth, should these actually be publicly held systems? Are we looking at something where we have to have some role of public governance? I'm curious what you think.
Totally with you here. I want to bring up a discussion that is happening, among some AI scientists. Thinking about the example in physics of the CERN in Europe, where huge amounts of money were poured in by governments to advance a science that would help everyone. So physics was really crucial in 50s and 60s for the reasons of nuclear power, for example, and nuclear dangers. But today, I think AI is one of those technologies and the underlying science that needs international coordination, both on the side of regulation, like we need to have teeth that are not just within our borders, but globally, and countries, in the same way that we've done for the nuclear issues, need to coordinate to minimize potential damage and regulate and bring much more transparency. But there's also the positive side. We need to make sure that the future progress is not owned by just a couple of companies, but actually happens in directions that benefit society. And that's going to happen if governments maybe create something like a CERN of AI. It doesn't have to be like actually physically centralized like CERN is. But if we want to develop AI that's going to help fight climate change, help with education and healthcare, for example, we're going to need to build these large neural nets that require huge amounts of capital, but hopefully that's going to be owned by us, by society, and targeted towards these benefits.
As I listen to you talk, and especially Kate, you reference history. So it's like, oh yeah, we've done this before, we can do it again. And I have to admit, part of me is like, there's no way government is going to move fast enough, not at the speed at which AI is moving. The difference, the progress between ChatGPT 3 and 4 is mind-boggling. So help me reconcile this, or confirm that my instinct is right and that we're really at the threshold of our regulators, our governments, influential people worldwide needing to step up faster than we've ever done before.
Well, you've isolated the thing that keeps me up at night, which is we know how fast this is moving now. I don't know about how you're feeling, but every week I'm like, oh my, another model, another set of things I need to research. It's an extraordinary pace. And Joshua and I were chatting backstage, neither of us expected that we would see this level of progress this quickly. And while it's exciting for its potential positive benefits, it presents a genuine challenge for regulators who do not move quickly by design, because they move slowly in order to listen to their constituents, in order to actually debate and reach a position of consensus on how to regulate. So we have a couple of, I think, quite positive signs on the horizon. Of course, the EU is about to pass its own AI Act. It's the first ever omnibus piece of legislation dedicated to AI. Because things are slow.
Maybe Canada will be to the goal.
Canada could be there faster. I'm hoping Canada gets there this year, but we'll see. But the issue, of course, is that if we look at the EU, it took them 4 years to draft this legislation, which happened before the generative AI turn. So we're already behind. Now, if we look at the US, it's radically depressing because we are so far behind. We had the great benefit briefly of having Dr. Alondra Nelson in the Office of Science and Technology Policy, who put forward a potential Bill of Rights for AI. But that is not regulation. That doesn't have the teeth that Joshua was speaking of. So how are we going to get the US, which is such a power center of these companies, to take the regulation as seriously as it takes the business side? I'm with you, and that's the thing that really does keep me up at night.
So I want to mention a couple of things that I think the Canadian government seems to be doing well here. One is similar to what the European regulation has, which is the regulation can be proportional to the level of risk, right? So, but the second one, I think, I mean, the tools of the regulation. The second one is something that I find really nice in the Canadian way of thinking about this, which is to create a principles-based law and then an adaptive set of regulations. So it's very difficult for politicians to change a law, and especially because parties change and whatnot. But we can agree on ethical objectives, and that can go into the law, and then the regulation can be, well, much faster, maybe not fast enough, but it's much better to do it this way. There's also an idea that I find interesting coming from Gillian Hepburn in Toronto, where she's thinking that, well, yeah, governments are too slow to adapt to these kinds of regulatory challenges, but maybe we could have independent third parties that are competing to provide regulations and that are like judged in terms of, well, how well they succeed to protect the public in particular areas or with the companies that they're working with. I think it's an interesting question, because there are issues with governments being have too much inertia, too slow, and bureaucratic. On how do we keep pace with the speed of the markets?
I'll be honest though, I worry that the only solution to regulation is to turn it into a market, a competitive market. I think part of the problem is in fact market dynamics.
Yeah, but that's what she's proposing.
Exactly. So I have real concerns about that. I mean, I think this is precisely what we want to avoid, is applying a market logic to everything that we do, all the way through to our governance and regulatory structures. I completely understand that the need to think about how do we have more flexible and adaptive approaches. But I do think that there is a virtue in
innovate. I mean, I think her point is that we need to innovate in how we regulate.
And I completely agree. But I also want to protect the value of what you have written about in terms of slow science.
Sure.
Slow regulation has also been beneficial. If we make the wrong regulations quickly, very bad things can happen. So how do we think about these questions around public utility, public ownership, and potentially a form of both national and international governance that prioritizes transparency, auditability, and again, testing the impacts of these systems. And if those impacts are negative, then frankly, we have to have accountability as well.
Yeah. So one of the key words you mentioned that I think can help us with that mismatch that we're talking about is transparency. So it's hard for the legislator to anticipate bad things that can happen. But if we, put in that transparency, these, audits and so on, the need for companies to document in detail what they're doing, then, and put the tools so that, okay, these people who represent people, the governments and so on, can raise flags. And when something maybe was kept secret, suddenly make it public, because companies don't want to have, bad things become public. So I think there may be ways to write regulation in such a way that companies will have a very strong incentive to avoid, not thinking about the bad things that can happen.
I completely agree. And I think what you're pointing to as well is a research challenge, that we actually need social scientists and humanists researching what are good regulatory structures, what are good regulatory mechanisms, and what are the ways in which we can hold companies accountable. If we're going to continue in this way where shareholder motivations are really driving the creation of so many systems, how can we have those forms of accountability that are really reliable, that we can point to and expect that they can prevent these harms? I think this is the question that for both of us, we have really thought about for the last few years, which is so much money goes into the technical side of thinking about these infrastructures, and so little investment has gone into these much more broad social, scientific, and humanistic questions around regulation, around management, and around accountability and transparency. And I think that's the big challenge facing us now, is to try and readdress that balance?
I would go even further, as you know, if I have time. So I think that we need to invest much more in social sciences and humanities to help us really rethink our societies at the level, of each country, but globally as well. And I think it's necessary because of what I was talking about before, this misalignment, which becomes more and more of a problem as the tools we're building become more powerful, and anybody can just explode it in our face. So, for example, the kind of competition that we're currently seeing between companies, it potentially a kind of race to the bottom in terms of carefulness and ethics, is an indication of how bad things can be in a few years when these tools could be doing much more damage. And for me, it's questioning. I think we should be questioning and asking, are there other political and economic models that we could think of, explore as alternatives to what we have now? I mean, we tend to think that what our current system is okay, and it has problems, but we don't even often think about, is there something really much better? Or actually, it's not even much better. I think if we don't really do these things, I'm not sure that humanity and civilization as we know it will be there in 50 years. And it's not just AI, we have climate crises, we have all kinds of very large scale crises, even the pandemics, where I don't think that our economic and political organization is appropriate. And there is not right now a lot of willingness to consider alternatives, but we should, and we should invest in the serious research about what are our options. How do we build a different world? Do we have examples of ways of humans to work together that would be less prone to the sort of dangers that we're talking about?
It's almost like you're saying AI, among other things, is provoking this new world order.
Yes.
And now's the time for,
We have to
a
think
bunch of
about
people
it.
to sit around the table and start doing this design and co-creation of this new world order, or it's just going to happen to us.
It's going to blow in our
It's
face.
just going to happen to us.
Yeah.
And I loved your invitation around actually structuring research around the governance. I think that this book was part of that. And if Joshua agrees, I think we should create a space for that at Mila. It's such a part of our DNA, and we'll figure out what that means. But I appreciate the need to say, okay, we need to invest as much on all of these questions and on the development of the technology itself. We're going to open it up to all of your questions in about a minute or two. How is that going to work? Is there a mic that's going to... Okay, so you just get up and someone will come to you with a mic. Wait for the mic to ask your question. Okay, one last prompt for the two of you before we open it up. So we talked about government and global coordination. Meanwhile, any words of wisdom for us as people, humble servants of society, researchers? What should any of us walk away with? What should we be thinking about?
Well, first of all, I'm excited that you're here to think about this with us. This is clearly the biggest challenge that we could be facing right now. And I find it incredibly heartening that Joshua and I, through very different paths of research, have come to exactly the same place, which is to say that we now need to emphasize a much bigger project than thinking about technical infrastructures. We need to think about what kind of world do we want to live in and how do we architect that? Because right now, those decisions around architecting power are not being made by us, actually. They're being made by an extremely small number of not elected officials who are actually creating systems that could be very general purpose and could have extraordinary far-reaching effects, some of which could be quite harmful, some of which could be beneficial. But the benefits and the risks there are not things that we are currently in the conversation with. So how do we shift that? And how do we start to see the imbrication or the interweaving of technology, labor, and the environment as things we have to think about together, to keep those three together in mind, because they are always profoundly interlaced. And that, to me, What we're giving to you today, I think, is a democratic challenge. How do we form this into a bigger public conversation and into real social change? That would be my provocation.
You said it almost all, but I want to emphasize one of the words you said, democracy. I think it's all about democracy. So in our discussion, we talked about concentration of power. Powerful tools lead to concentration of power. And that's why we need to change the system in small ways and eventually bigger ways to make sure that we preserve that beautiful thing that is democracy. But there's also not just power is distributed. There's another value that's very dear to me, and that is at the heart of the scientific community that I think we need to really put more center stage, and that is truth. That is really about like a culture that values truth, because ultimately that's what makes democracy possible. Information needs to be accessible. And the last thing I want to mention is, it may seem a little bit kind of overwhelming, like what, any of us, what can we do, right? But I think we can reflect on what's happened with the climate crisis. A lot of people feel helpless, like, what can I do? I'm a small citizen, all these powerful people are doing things I may disagree with, but it's because a lot of people think that a problem is important, that things move. So we all have the possibility of being part of making a better world.
Thank you. All right. Questions dans la salle, questions from all of you. You will not have this opportunity often.
So for those who have questions, you can follow Cal and there'll be a line. We have something about 15 minutes for the question period. So try to make your question quite short and not a 2-3-sided question, just a one-sided question, please. Thanks.
Thank you so much for a great
We can
presentation.
make our answers short.
Or great discussion. But I do have a question there, and Kate, this is for you. You said that innovate how we regulate. And the interesting thing is that if we look at the previous crisis, like using democracy for climate has obviously not worked in terms of how fast we agreed on the Paris Agreement. It took 12 years between the UN's foundation until we had the International Atomic Agency or Energy Agency. So how do you think that will work? And isn't the approach that OpenAI is taking now by closing their research a way to try to innovate the regulatory space? Because they're closing down, not making it publicly available, not helping others in adopting these technologies. Isn't that a way to innovate?
That's a fantastic question. And let me say that one of the things that worries me most about OpenAI's approach is that Sam Altman and others have said, we need regulation. It is urgent that we have regulation. And they're not giving us the means to know how to regulate a system by closing it down and making it completely opaque to regulators. So you can't have your cake and eat it too. If you actually want both science to build on your work, if you want regulators to create good regulatory structures, you need more openness, you need more transparency. So I think one of the first questions we have to face from a regulatory perspective is, how can you ensure at least some culture of transparency? Because I'm seeing the same thing that you're seeing, which is a rapid closing down of information at the same time as you're seeing a rapid concentration of power. And that should be a deep concern to all of us. And I think one of the things that hopefully everybody in this room today is hearing from both Joshua and I is a really clear clarion call for rapid change now, that this is urgent and this is extremely serious, because what you just described is an inherently anti-democratic tendency. Thanks.
Hi there, Martin Patrick. I'm a journalist with The Logic in Montreal.
We don't hear you.
Is that?
That's better.
Oh, I'm too tall. Get that a lot. I was thinking about your example of the player piano and the Copyright Act. There's about 15-year window in there. and using that as sort of like as a precedent for what can happen. But we have a massive precedent already with Facebook or any other big tech company like that. 15 years ago, Facebook started, and I'm in a room full of researchers right now. I've spoken to countless researchers who say we try to get data. It's opaque. We never get anything. 15 years on, Facebook remains the picture of opacity when it comes to being able to look at the building blocks of this stuff, which is data. So I guess if it hasn't worked with Facebook, if it hasn't worked with big tech, why on earth would it work with AI? If we're shoveling it into Facebook or a chatbot, to me, there doesn't seem to be much difference.
Well, let's talk about the realpolitik of what happened with Facebook. You're absolutely right that we saw absolute disasters like Cambridge Analytica before we saw any real regulatory conversation. But there has been an important shift in DC. Have a look at how much money tech companies are spending on lobbyists to shift and prevent real regulation from happening. That is a profound issue that has, I think, in many cases, slowed down any real regulatory will in DC. And so if we're going to see any change this time around, if I'm going to give you an optimistic perspective here, it's that what we're seeing now with AI is so general purpose. It's not a social network that you can choose to join or leave. These are tools that will affect you no matter if you choose to participate them or not. And I think that presents our regulators with a far higher degree of responsibility for their constituents. But we still face this very real problem of an enormous amount of money in DC there to prevent real regulation. So what that gets down to is pressure from us, from citizens on our politicians to say we have to see action here because that's the only way we're going to see change, which is not to say I'm being a Pollyanna here. I think it's extremely difficult. But if we're going to see these tools applied simultaneously to every industry you can think of, to hospitals, to schools, to every white-collar office, then there is a very large population of people who should be having a say in this.
I just want to add, yes, in the past, civil society has been trying to push things to improve some of the issues you've been talking about. And because it was too slow or it didn't work, doesn't mean that we shouldn't keep trying and working hard towards those goals. You just have to. That's the only thing we can do.
Thanks.
So hi, Simon Julien, professor at University of Montreal and Mila. Trying to find a way to ask this question. It's basically at the heart, we're talking about putting pressure on our politicians to change things, but what about the people who work at these companies? And in particular, you work at Microsoft Research, major investor of OpenAI. I don't want to single out Microsoft. There's also other big companies. What can these people do? You are also, not just you, but these people are privy to some of the things that they're thinking. Like, how can we shift the power? Like, that's the question. Not easy question.
I can say a few words. I have lots of friends working in these companies. And I think most of these people want to do good. So we need to nourish that kind of culture. One thing we can do here, for example, in academia is educate our grad students who will be the next working force in those companies working on AI to care about social values, to care about social impact, care about society, so that when they will be hired, their voice will be at least something to contend with. Of course, it's not enough. We need to change the way governments are dealing with these, but it's important to keep in mind that the vast majority of people in companies are just trying to do their best in a good human way, but they're part of a system of profit maximization, and the companies that are not sufficiently pushing for profit maximization fail. So there's like a survival of the most profitable, and we shouldn't put the onus on those people working in those companies. It's really the responsibility of governments to put the right guardrails.
I would absolutely agree with that. And I would add to it that one of the things that has actually produced real change in the last few years has been workers inside tech companies. We have seen an enormous worker movement to prevent the use of AI in weapons work inside Google and multiple other companies. We've seen tech workers actually unionize for the first time. And we've also seen a few people bravely speak out when they see things happening inside their companies that are concerning them. And so I would say that they're the people we should be really careful to tune in and listen, because when those people are ringing alarms, something very serious is happening.
Hi, this is Golnush. Thank you for the debate. I have this question of, so you're talking about a slow science and a slow regulations. I'm just afraid that like we are going to face a disaster similar what happened to nuclear, right? And actually, I truly believe that we are actually experiencing that disaster gradually, and we are like kind of like frogs in this boiling water, and we are not really seeing what is happening to our lives. And AI is affecting people's lives, right? What we should do, because some of the questions that I have in my mind is that like regulations, transparency, yes. I think like it's not just the open AI. I think the technology was in a stage, and if it's not open AI, it's going to be company X, right? I don't think it's surprising to see this kind of technologies coming out, right? But what is strange to me is that we are way, way behind actually knowing what is the harm. So even if they are transparent, if we know what is the model, what is the data, how we can measure the harm, we don't know it. I think because I'm working on this topic myself, it's still at the earliest stage of recognizing what are the harms of this model. So I just want to ask you, like, what do you think? Like what we should do as an action, right? So me as a researcher working on this topic, like what I should do to make sure that it's not happening. And it is a disaster that's happening. Like what I'm saying is that like I should do it faster, right? Thank you.
This is a really important question too. And I guess I would say two things. I think your diagnosis is correct, that we're seeing a diffuse set of slow rolling crises for now. And that could change as these systems quickly start to filter into so many industries at the same time. But you're asking this question around harms that I think is really interesting. And I want to point to something that I think OpenAI did that was really good in their recent report, was that they had what they call a system card. And that system card is building on work that Timnit and I and other colleagues did with our work on data sheets for data sets, and then Meg Mitchell and others did with model cards for model reporting, that we're now seeing system cards. And what I see in that system card, if you read it very closely, it outlines several very real risks that OpenAI sees and does not have mitigations for, including that chatbots can concretize ideologies and ideas that we will have no way of actually remedying. And then it says something very interesting. After outlining disinformation harms, privacy harms, discrimination harms, ideological harms, it then says all of these harms are the way that AI will go unless we put in very clear ways of stopping it. And what we haven't done is put in those ways of stopping it yet. So I think what we're hearing, even from inside the house, so the call is coming from inside the building, that at OpenAI, people are telling us that they're seeing these risks, and yet we do not have the mitigations yet. So that is a very clear challenge to everybody in this room. How do we address that challenge in our work?
Just want to add, I think there are both technical efforts that can be made to try to address some of these challenges, but also regarding the urgency and so on. It's part of the conversation we're having, and a lot of the previous questions. And I would like to mention here the role of the media, because if governments are not going to do anything if they don't feel the pressure from the people and the media being their voice. If there is not enough concern in the population about these questions, nothing's going to happen, or it's going to be extremely slow. So those conversations we're having today are very important for that. Thanks for your work on this.
Ma question portait pour Monsieur Bengio. Je me demandais si c'était possible d'élaborer sur la solution que vous ameniez plus tôt, qui impliquait des tiers parties pour faire partie comme organisme de régulation. Ça ressemblerait à quoi? Est-ce que ce serait comme un organisme de certification biologique, de projet responsable en IA? Ou quelle serait votre vision par rapport à ça? Merci.
C'est une bonne question. Je ne pense pas que les réponses soient complètement claires là-dessus, mais pensons par exemple là, avec les problèmes qui existent aussi, là, ce qui a été mis en place au niveau de la réglementation, des contrôles dans le domaine de la finance. Donc, il y a des tiers parties qui ont à perdre leur réputation et qui essayent de minimiser les risques dans ce cas-là financier et qui peuvent agir de manière différente. Là où on doit faire attention, et c'est un problème dans le système financier aujourd'hui, c'est qu'on ne veut pas que ces gens-là soient rémunérés par les entreprises qui vont surveiller. Okay? Donc ça, c'est clairement un problème. Mais on peut imaginer un cadre légal qui fait en sorte qu'il y ait des entreprises qui développent, qui surveillent d'autres entreprises en suivant un peu les principes que les gouvernements auront mis de l'avant.
Merci beaucoup. On a le temps malheureusement pour 2 autres questions. So 2 questions more. I'm sorry for the people on the line. We're running late a little bit, so very sorry for that.
Good morning, Elif Mueller, associate member here at Mila. So you talked about the 6 AI companies that hold the keys to generative AI. I'd like to bring to the conversation what I think was an important shift in personal computing OS landscape towards digital freedom made by Linux and open source software. Are you aware of open source community-driven efforts that are trying to match the private investments? How far behind are they? Is data holding them back? Is it possible that regulation, e.g. who owns data, could hurt rather than help such community efforts from becoming mainstream? And how could we ensure such efforts flourish in a regulatory context?
Maybe I'm going to say a few words about this. Yes, there are community efforts, but they don't have enough capital to bring things to the scale that we're seeing with, say, OpenAI. And I think it is therefore extremely important that governments understand that, collectively we need to invest in alternatives to make sure that power is less concentrated, to make sure also that we make AI work for the benefit of society. At the same time, we have to be careful, but I think it's going to be careful for the same reasons that OpenAI are saying that they're not making their code available. We want to make sure those tools are used in a controlled way. I think there are ways to do all that. But I don't think governments have yet understood that they need to invest the kind of capital that companies are currently investing to build tools in sort of a community spirits.
And if I may, I just noticed that the 2 people who sat down were both women. Could I invite you back up just because for the issues of diversity, because it's something that we really take very seriously. If each of you could just say your question quickly, all 3 of you, I don't want to shut you down, sir, as well. Please stay. But if each of you just say your question quickly, the 2 of us can choose which ones we can respond to with our last few minutes.
I really appreciate that. Thank you. So my question is, there was a lot of mention about how extractive artificial intelligence is and some of the risks that it poses to important institutions like our democracy. But my question is, do you see potential of AI being restorative in any ways, whether that's through universal basic income or other opportunities that it might present throughout that value chain that, Kate, you've done so much research on? Thank you.
Hi, thank you. So my question builds on Yashua's point about our systems, our governance systems being not fit for purpose. So specifically, in a globalized context, and looking at companies, big tech in particular, from the lens of not being just an entity to regulate, but also an entity that is providing and functions that are historically been given by governance and in a certain way replacing governance. So how can we look at big tech maybe from the same lens that founding fathers of many democratic countries looked at, to put some guarantees about the power of these companies, the same way like a country in the past like could still abuse power. So that's my first question. My second question is more building on intergovernmental efforts. So, and cooperation. So there are many forums now from, the OECD, from APEC, from TTC, from also the Global Partnership on AI. Where do you see maybe the missing links, and where do we need more work to improve cooperation? Thank you.
I'm going to say very quickly a few words about the first question from Allison. I think that you're putting your finger on something really important, which is, especially if we have investments like coming from governments, like really targeted at the well-being of everyone, they can be specifically targeted at innovations that will help to distribute power more. So a very obvious example is AI that can help democratize education and justice, by the way. And I mean, if done right, I think that there's a huge potential here to bring billions of people out of the illiteracy that they're in, using those tools. And by the way, I do think that humans are essential in education, but that's a longer conversation.
And I'll address the first part of your second question, which is this idea of the fact that we're starting to see the private sector, and particularly this very small group of technology companies, really taking on the role that was once given to governments. And that's not an accident. That is a very clear encroachment on particular sorts of services that were once understood to be publicly owned. And it's precisely that type of enclosure, as it was traditionally called, from the sort of 1500s onwards in the UK, where we started to see sort of the enclosure of public lands for private ownership and wealth, that we've now seen in the public sector, in public sector services. And that points exactly not to me oh, let's just give it to the private sector, but the opposite, which is to say, when the private sector is saying these are public goods, but we're going to capitalize on them, the public has the opportunity to say, which one of those things should now remain in public hands? Where are these infrastructures actually suitable for nationalization, for actually re-enriching the public? So I think we can actually take a much more radical line on understanding that shift that you absolutely rightly pointed to. And I think to the second question, what we are starting to see at the international level of governance is still quite nascent. And the problem that I'm seeing with some of the organizations you mentioned, such as the Global Partnership, it's a fantastic idea, but it doesn't have the force of regulation. So we're at a moment in history where international regulatory bodies like the UN are losing respect and strength. So one of the things we need to do is strengthen those muscles to say that international governance is what is going to be essential for both the climate crisis and for governing AI. Thanks for the question.
So when we publish an updated version of this book, it's going to be a whole day event, because it feels cruel to stop this conversation at this stage. Thank you to each and every one of you for making the time. This is not something 1 or 2 or 3 world leaders can carry. It's something we must all carry. I think that message was clear. Merci. Thank you to Benjamin Prudhomme. This is the result of your vision and your conviction. And you could have quit 1,000 times along the way and you didn't. It's the only reason we're here. Yoshua, you're an inspiration and such a privilege to have as a colleague. Your fire lights flames in all of us, and we will humbly do our best to use everything you've created here at Mila to honor this vision you have. And Kate, you are so courageous, and I'm so grateful for you just saying it as it is. And this conversation needs more of us going to that length and just saying it and calling it and asking for clarification and asking for change. So thank you so much. Merci tout le monde. Bon après-midi.
Merci Valérie. So you can have coffees and teas over there. You have croissant. I will ask Joshua, Kate, Gulnush, Benjamin, and Valérie to go over the wall for an official picture. And after Benjamin and Joshua will be available for medias. Thank you to everybody.